Hey guys, Sam from West Meadow Rabbits here. As promised, long time in coming, but it's happening now. I'm going to make a video on how to prepare for, kill, and butcher a meat rabbit. Now, obviously, as the name implies, this channel, and I assume all of you, are interested in raising meat rabbits. And the final part of raising meat rabbits is converting that rabbit into meat. Obviously, this video we're not going to cover the actual butchering. That's going to be the next video. Today I just want to talk about how we actually prepare for and get ready to do that, because it does require a minor amount of preparation. Once you get used to it, it's a pretty quick process, but we do need to discuss just a couple things and what you need to prepare for, what you need to do, what you need to have. So nothing graphic in this video, no need to worry, purely educational, so we can just get right into it. So obviously the first thing you're going to need is a good quality knife. I cannot stress the importance of this enough. So your knife is going to be your best friend in this situation, and I'm sure anybody who's cooked before has heard the saying that a dull knife is much more dangerous than a sharp knife. That goes doubly so when we're dealing with an animal. It will be dead, obviously, when we're using the knife on it, but still. And obviously for your own safety, there's going to be animal bodily fluids, there's going to be a lot of stuff going on, and we don't need any nicks, cuts, and a dull knife can do some serious damage, especially a knife designed for butchering an animal. So what kind of knife do you want to go for? This knife, believe it or not, was I think like 15 bucks from bassequipment.com, which is a small animal supply manufacturer. I love this thing. It's commercial grade, you know, it's got the easy clean micro-resistant plastic. It's got a steel blade that was actually made in Japan, believe it or not. So it's a very good quality blade. Sharpens like a dream every time. It's not too big, as you can see. I'm not saying you have to get this knife, but you generally are going to want a knife that's for filleting or boning, are the most common names that you'll see. They're kind of going to be a good knife for allowing you to get into small spaces. They're going to be nice and sharp, allow you to get the pelt off pretty easy. Generally, this knife I would say is about roughly 5.5 to 6 inches long. I wouldn't go any longer than that because you're going to get into a real unwieldy situation. You don't want it too short either, and you don't want it too thick because, again, you're going to have to get into certain spaces. And, of course, it's got to be easy to clean and easy to sharpen. Bringing me to my next point, we really need to keep these things sharp, especially before we butcher. Believe it or not, hair does a number on knife sharpness, really dulls them. And it's basically impossible to skin a rabbit without cutting through some hair. So I like to have a knife sharpener of some kind. This one's pretty basic. I think we got it at Walmart. It's a 3-stage sharpener, you know, getting progressively finer. And you don't have to do anything crazy. So what I do is I just, after the initial use, every time I use it, I hone it, which I've already done for this knife. Honing, if you don't know, it's that stick that you see that comes with knife sets. You run your knife up and down. It's not for sharpening, believe it or not. It's for straightening out the blade because it can get micro bends in it, basically, which make it sharpen unevenly. There's a lot of great videos on YouTube of chefs showing you how to hone knives. They'll do it better than I ever will, so I'm not even going to attempt to do that. And there's also a lot of videos on sharpening that are probably better than mine, but this works for me. So basically I just take it and I make sure to get full contact with the entire knife, and I do it like, you know, 3 or 4 times. That's the first one. Then there's the second stage. Again, 3 or 4 times, making sure to get the entire knife even pressure on there. And then the last stage, same deal. And you got to kind of move it a little bit so it gets the tip. You're going to want that tip nice and sharp because you're going to be using it to poke through and cut a lot of stuff. So get yourself a good knife sharpener and make sure you know how to use it. Make sure your knife is honed, and that's going to take you 90% of the way. Now, a couple other things before I get into the actual stuff we need to kill the rabbit. First, we need to make sure we've got some kind of splash guard, if you will, because things are going to get messy. I've got my 3 sizes too small, disgusting, shrunken American flag apron, so I'll put that on when the time comes. Does the job. I'm not really worried about my clothes. It's more just to have something clean to wipe my hands on. I do recommend you have some paper towels around or rags that you're fine to wash because it's going to get a little messy. It'll also depend on how many rabbits you're killing, but we'll get into that in a second. Next thing you're going to need is some kind of rinsing / cooling vessel, if you will. I've just got a little pot today because I'm only doing one and things aren't going to get too crazy. If you've got access to water, it makes it 1,000 times easier. So what the process for me is going to be, I'm going to kill the rabbit, hang it up, butcher it, put it in here to cool it off, take that into my house, then rinse, wash it off in the sink. But if you've got an outdoor sink or somewhere that you've got something off the ground, I don't recommend holding the rabbit and just hosing it off, because sooner or later you're going to drop the rabbit on the ground, stuff could splash, it's not sanitary. So if you've got an outdoor sink set up, which is pretty cheap to get, and you can run a hose to it, that's ideal. I can't do it obviously because I'm in a residential neighborhood and I can't have a mini slaughterhouse in my backyard, so all my infrastructure is pretty portable and pretty low key. But if you've got the space or a fenced in backyard, I highly recommend getting some kind of sink, and then you can just hang your rabbit above that, wash it as you go, keeps things clean, keeps things nice. It would definitely be on my wish list if I can ever get a situation where I can have that. But you need access to water regardless, whether that's in a pot or two. So usually I'll bring one pot for rinsing my hands in, rinsing my knife in, and another for putting the rabbit in after I finish butchering it to cool it off. And then I take it inside and rinse it again, which brings me to my next point. After you've cleaned off the rabbit, you're going to need a way to store it. It's going to be wet, and when rabbits get wet, don't freak out if the meat starts getting slimy. It's called a lot of different things. Some people call it silver skin. It's basically this membrane that is between the muscle and the skin that you've removed, the pelt. It's very slimy. It almost looks mucusy when it gets wet in water. That's nothing to freak out about. It's totally normal. So what I like to do is I take the rabbit after I've cleaned it, I lie it down on this baking sheet, which essentially has this little metal grill for roasting meats. And it's about an inch off the baking sheet. So I put the rabbit on there, and then I put this in the fridge. And I let that age for usually 3 days. Now, why do I age the rabbit meat? It dries the outer layer out. It makes it look more like a really nice, if you've ever seen a whole piece of like a deli meat, like a piece of pork that's been aged. It's a beautiful looking thing. It's got nice color. It doesn't look pale. It looks healthy. The meat skin, the surface of the meat dries off, so it's not slimy. And a big thing with rabbits is it really helps tenderize the meat. So when you kill a rabbit, it's going to taste the best if you eat it within like an hour of killing it, or you wait 3 days. Because what happens is, once the animal's dead, it goes into rigor mortis, and that muscle tenses up for 2 or 3 days, and then after that, the muscles again relax, they move out of rigor mortis, and they begin to break down, which makes the meat way more tender, more flavorful, and much easier to eat. Another way to get around this is people brine it in salt, but I prefer to dry age. And, most of the meat you get in the grocery store is at least a couple weeks old, so it's way outside of rigor mortis. So the thing you'll notice with fresh meat is people will say, oh, I just killed this rabbit, and it's fresh, and it's in the backyard, but it's not really tender, it's very gamey. And it's not because the animal is any less tender than a supermarket meat. It's because it hasn't been aged. It's totally okay to age meat. Just make sure it has circulation and air. I would not recommend putting it in a bag where it's going to have its moisture. After you've aged it, you can freeze it, or conversely, right after you kill it, you can freeze it. But it's good to let it sit for at least a couple days. In my opinion, you can do what you want. It's not going to kill you either way. It's just a taste thing. That brings me to my fourth point. We got to talk about what size rabbit you're killing. If you're new to butchering rabbits, I assume this is going to be younger rabbits. Usually a rabbit is ready to butcher between 8 and 12 weeks. That's about 5 pounds. That's going to be a fryer. That's the kind of animal that you get in the store with a chicken. It's a young animal. It's very tender. It hasn't gone through essentially puberty yet, which is going to really change the character of the animal itself. So with a fryer, the pelt is very loose. It's going to come off easy. The meat, you're probably going to get about 3 pounds of meat off a fryer, a 5-pound fryer, and that's usually the age I recommend people butcher them at. More important is the weight than the age, so you want 5 pounds. Basically, that's going to make it worth your effort. That will probably be 8 to 12 weeks. Better your genetics, better your feeding program. 8 weeks will be closer to when it hits 5 pounds, but again, it's not a deal breaker. It's just an efficiency thing. So if it doesn't bother you, whatever. So with a fryer, you don't need as much effort, basically, in any respect. It's not going to produce as much mess. It's not going to be as hard to kill. It's not going to be as hard to remove the pelt. You'll get less meat, and the pelt won't really be usable because it'll be too thin, but that's a trade-off. The next size up is a roaster, which is essentially a 6-month-old rabbit, basically a mature rabbit, between 6 months and a year, really. And that animal is going to have a thicker pelt. It's going to be significantly harder to remove the pelt. It's not impossible, obviously, by any stretch of the imagination. The pelt may be usable for tanning. You're probably looking at, 8-pound animal, 8 to 9-pound animal, if we're talking about New Zealand's or other standard meat rabbits. And it will take significantly more effort to kill it. And then finally, the largest class is a stewer, which is anything older than a year. This is a full-grown or older rabbit. The pelts will be magnificent. You'll probably get a 10 to 12-pound animal giving you, 7 pounds of meat. It's quite a big meal. But as again, the names apply, the way you cook them is different. So the older the animal, the less tender the meat's going to be, and but the better the pelt will be. However, again, I'd really like to emphasize, aging can kind of dramatically affect that. So if you age your meat, even an older animal is going to tenderize significantly. Now, finally, the last thing we need to talk about is how we're actually going to do the killing. There's a lot of debate out there about how to do this. There are many, many different methods. I'm only going to talk about the one that I personally use and works for me. I'll briefly mention the other ones, but basically all of them involve stunning or rendering the animal somehow unconscious so it doesn't feel pain, and then bleeding the animal, which is incredibly important to make sure the blood gets out of the meat. So there's a couple main ways to do this. One is directly attacking the brain, if you will, and this is either using a BB gun or some type of spring-loaded ballista. And this is the method I would least recommend, believe it or not. People usually tend to gravitate towards this because it seems less brutal, but a rabbit brain is very small, and if you miss, not only is that incredibly unethical, I mean, it's going to be a very unpleasant experience. It's going to be highly disturbing for all parties involved, and it's not a good situation. You need certainty, and a rabbit's brain is just too small, and they can move suddenly, and in my opinion, it's just not worth the risk. And I would not, when it works, it's perfectly humane, but taking that risk, in my opinion, is not humane. This basically leaves you with two other options: blunt force trauma or cervical dislocation. Cervical dislocation is the fancy way of saying breaking their necks, and blunt force trauma is the fancy way of saying kind of bludgeoning them. There's a great video by Daniel Salatin, who works on Polyface Farms. Joel Salatin is a pretty famous sustainable meat farmer. It basically shows him, he takes the rabbit, takes a nice piece of iron, whacks them hard on the back of the head, then hangs them up and bleeds them. And that whack on the back of the head is more than lethal. It will render them completely stunned, if not dead, so you have no problems bleeding them there. Or you can do a couple different methods for breaking their neck. I would not recommend doing it by hand. There's basically two popular methods. One is the broomstick or shovel method, where you essentially put the rabbit on the ground, lie a piece of a rod over the back of their neck. It could be rebar, it could be a broom, and you put your foot on either side quickly and pull up on the feet, thus separating the neck and the head. And this is a pretty much instant death. There is no question to whether the animal is dead or not. It is most certainly dead. Because the brain and body connection has been totally severed, and many times this will actually tear the veins in the neck and it'll start bleeding it before you even slit the throat. So a lot of times you'll cut the throat and see a lot of blood built up. Now, the problem with this method, and it's not really a problem if you don't mind it, but it produces a ton of bruising along the neck. As I said, it sort of ruptures all those veins, so it doesn't really affect the overall ability of the rabbit to be bled. However, it will discolor the meats around the neck and shoulders, requires a bit more cleaning. On the other hand, stunning them with a blunt force trauma and then slitting their throats pretty much guarantees that you're going to have a much cleaner looking animal and it will be bled more fully. However, there's always the risk, if you're not confident enough, that you don't hit it hard enough and the animal is not fully stunned. And again, to some people, hitting the rabbit seems more brutal than dislocating the neck. Personally, in Massachusetts, we are not allowed to sell rabbit meat, which is a subject for an entirely different video. If you're lucky to live in a state that's got its head screwed on right, you may be able to sell meat from your backyard. If that's the case, you're going to want to worry about how the meat looks a little bit more than I would. So I use cervical dislocation, and I think it's a good place to start because it's the least likely situation where you're going to have a mistake. And but you can find what works for you. And basically what I would recommend for that, I talked about the broomstick method. The other method, my girlfriend's brother is kind enough to make these for me, is some kind of rabbit ringer, hopper popper, called a variety of things. But basically, it screws into a solid surface like a tree or a thick piece of wood in a building. You take the rabbit, you slide its neck in here, face forward, you pull down on the feet, and it dislocates it. And again, that provides a nice instant kill and gives you time to bleed the rabbit. Now, I wouldn't use this one specifically for older rabbits. This is fine for fryers, but this metal is too thin for a large rabbit. It will bend, because basically the older the rabbit, the more muscle it has and the more force is required to break its neck. So I recommend, making sure you choose appropriately. And if you're going to be doing a large animal, you probably want a significantly thicker piece of metal. But yeah, those are the methods that you can do. I prefer the cervical dislocation. Again, don't be surprised when it causes a little bit of bruising on the meat, but again, nothing that affects the palatability. Then finally, after you've killed the animal, you have to find some place to hang it up. Again, courtesy of girlfriend's brother. This screws in. I poke holes behind the Achilles tendon, between the bone and the Achilles tendon, and I just hook the meat on here. For a first timer, I wouldn't recommend that. I actually would probably recommend you use a slip knot and hang from something really sturdy. Use a couple slip knots that are even height. That way you can just slide the feet in and slip knot it tight, because you're going to need to bleed it pretty fast, because you need to bleed the animal while the heart's still beating, which allows the blood to be pumped out. And no matter which method you choose here, you need to be prepared for how this is going to play out, because again, a lot of people, we've been really desensitized to death. If you're watching some movie, usually the hunter comes up and he shoots the animal and it dies peacefully, and it's all very majestic and everything, but that's not how life is. In real life, there's going to be a lot of twitching, there's going to be kicking. It's probably going to last a few minutes. I've even had rabbits that have been fully skinned with all their organs out, and I go to pull the heart out and the heart's still beating. It's messy, it's bloody, but that's nature, that's the real world, and there's nothing to be intimidated by. It's okay. This is going to be something that you're going to learn how to do, and you're going to get good at it. It's just a learning curve. And remember, for most of human history, if you want to meat, this is how it went down. I can pretty much guarantee you, your grandma or great-grandma, if she wanted chicken for dinner, she wasn't going to Market Basket to pick up a nice chicken breast for $3.99. You would go and you would kill the animal and do this. So if little 90-year-old women can do this, I know you can. And with that, we will get into it in the next video. So stay tuned, guys. These should be released at the same time. And yeah, I'll see you in the next video.